How many preps do you have? Do you have 3, 4, or more, or know someone who does? Well, if you do, stick around for this episode. Often we equate 3 or 4 more preps with 3 or 4 times the work. In this episode, Sophie Forker, who is a French and Spanish teacher in New York City, joins me for a conversation about managing our teacher workload. We talk specifically about navigating a large number of preps, but it ultimately comes down to useful and actionable ways to streamline your lesson planning, whether you have 1 prep or 6. So let's jump in. Are you a language teacher looking for some reassurance that what you're doing in the classroom is on the right track? Or maybe you're looking for some ways to teach even more effectively. If you're one or the other or somewhere in between, you've landed in the right place. This is the World Language Classroom Podcast with your host, me, Joshua Cabral. You're about to get tips, tools, and resources so that your students continue to rise in proficiency and communicate with confidence. Let's jump in. Vamos, allons-y. Hello, my friends. Bonjour, mes amis. Hola, mis amigos. Welcome to the World Language Classroom Podcast. I am Joshua Cabral, and thank you for listening. You know, I always have to remind you, because you can never hear it enough, that you are an incredible educator doing great stuff. So thank you for taking the time out of your week to listen to a podcast about language teaching, because that's just one of the many things that you are doing to make sure that you are the best teacher you can possibly be. So thank you so much for doing that. So speaking of being the best teacher you can possibly be, we are going to talk about something that's kind of nitty-gritty about our teaching, and it's about the number of preps that some teachers might have. And some of us maybe have 1 or 2, some may have several more than that. And that requires some management of time. So in case that is the situation for you, you are going to have some great insights from our conversation today. And if it's not you personally, you might have colleagues or family members who are also teachers that are in this realm. So you could share out this episode with them or even share the insights with them as well. But to have this conversation with us today, we are joined by Sophie Forker, who is a French and Spanish teacher in New York City. And she has presented at Practical and Comprehensible, which is a virtual conference. And she actually presented on this topic last year where I first saw it. She has also presented at Express Fluency in their conference in the cloud and at NABE, which is the National Association of Bilingual Educators. Thank you so much for being with us today, Sophie.
So excited to be here. Bonjour.
Bonjour, bonjour. Is there anything you'd like to share with us that would help us better understand your approach to teaching and to get to know you a little better?
This is really exciting because I've listened to this podcast, so it's really cool to be a guest today. Something that's also really important in my practice is I'm a queer teacher and I'm also the GSA supervisor at my school. So it's really important to me to have students see themselves reflected in my curriculum, both in terms of like queer identities and Black and Brown students. So I try to be really intentional about making all students feel really accepted and recognized in my classroom. And I do it for myself too. Especially like with my students in the GSA, it really helps me to feel seen in my own classroom.
I just want to unpack that a little bit. So
Yeah.
Could you give us an example of something that you do in your classroom that brings in those various voices that might not typically be in a language classroom?
I always start the year with presenting the different options for gender neutral pronouns. Additionally, just in the resources that I choose, I read with my students this past year in the spring, Julien est une sirène, or it's in Spanish, it's Julián es una sirena. You might have heard of it. It's a picture book that's about a kid who sees the mermaid parade in Coney Island and wants to be a mermaid. And I won't spoil it for you, but it's a book that has a queer main character and beautiful illustrations as well. So thinking about the resources that I choose and trying to have it reflect many identities.
Thank you for sharing that with us and your personal experience with it as well. Let's start this conversation about managing our preps, so that's fun. Let's talk about managing preps. Why not? And this is something that definitely teachers have to navigate in their own teaching. And so what has been your personal experience of being put in that position of having multiple preps?
Since the very beginning of my career as a teacher, even when I was a student teacher, I had lots of preps. But at my current school, I have the most that I've ever had before. So I'm the only French teacher at my school, which I think is an experience that many people have who teach French. So I teach French levels 1, 2, 3, and 4. And then additionally, I also teach Spanish 1.
So this does end up being the reality for many German teachers who end up being the singleton teachers in their school. It also happens more now with Chinese teachers, certainly Latin teachers, and I hear it all the time from French teachers where you're having the multiple levels. And I think it's one of those both and things where you do get to have the same students and see them progress in their proficiency year after year, but then there's the other side of having to plan for it all. So for you personally, what are some effective strategies for planning and organizing all of these multiple language preps to ensure that you stay on top of your workload? What has worked well for you?
I am a huge proponent of the idea of teacher as a curator. So absolutely, number one piece of advice is do not reinvent the wheel on anything because somebody else has done it. I'm in a lot of Facebook groups where I just search whatever I'm looking for and I will eventually find something like that. Usually the ones that I go through are French teachers in the US and then CI for French teachers, which is also moderated by Cécile Lenné, who's awesome. Mm-hmm. I tend to use kind of thematic units. You can build on the same units year after year and kind of just like structure your activities to be similar. And then other than that, routines are really good. So having routines set up for your class so that you don't have to plan every minute of the class every day.
And when you talk about routines, you're talking about sort of doing picture talks or calendar talks or special person interviews where you're doing those in every class. Are those the kind of routines you're talking about?
Yeah, exactly. Or things like having weekend chat on Mondays and then maybe having a check-in every day and then maybe having like one day a week that you do reading FER at the beginning of class or 1 or 2 days a week so that you have a little bit of like structure set up for your class. And that always makes me feel really, really good when I'm making my slides where I'm like, I can just copy and paste this slide. And now I know that 10 minutes is already accounted for and it doesn't get old. It's important for the students and it's good practice, but it also helps with the planning.
And those routines are happening at every level on those days. Like every Monday, all of your classes are doing this. Every Thursday, all of your classes are doing this. So the routines, that's what's keeping it manageable in terms of the slides and the cutting and pasting because you're doing it at different levels.
Exactly. Yes. And for weekend chat, I have like slightly different slides for different levels so that it gets a little bit more open-ended for the higher levels. But yes, I can do the same thing in every class.
How have you been managing the idea of prioritizing your planning to make sure that each class is actually getting the attention they need and deserve without being overwhelming?
So I do have normally in my schedule 3 sections of level 1. So it'll be like Spanish 1. I had last year 2 Spanish ones and then 1 French one. So for that group, I would do the same exact activities. And even though it was different languages, I would do more or less the same thing. And activities meaning like the same game or the same partner activity, even if the vocabulary was different. And sometimes with like CI strategies, vocabulary can be different from like one Spanish 1 class to the other, depending on what you're talking about. Like if you talked about a student the previous day or you did card talk or something. So that is something that helps me a lot. For my upper levels have been places where I've been a little bit more creative in terms of like thematic units and that kind of thing. I always have like either worked with a colleague to kind of brainstorm ideas or taken ideas from other teachers that I follow on Instagram or that I know about that will be able to help me. So trying to do kind of like similar activities and games with multiple levels to just like not have a million different things that you're doing on one day. The other thing that I feel like has been a learning curve for me is just like managing my energy, because I think the most important thing is when you're in the classroom to be present. And especially with acquisition-driven instruction, to be able to kind of like go with the flow, you need to really be like listening. And if you're already exhausted because you've been prepping till like 7 p.m. the previous night, you might not be able to like have as much of that communication and I guess authenticity with your students. If you're just, I can't wait to go to sleep. I'm still working on this, but working on being okay with not having everything be perfect and ready to go, and be okay with a little bit of flexibility.
So as you are navigating your day, and you had mentioned that you're doing similar activities, whether it's like a weekend chat or calendar talk, anything that's kind of the same that's happening on different levels, how are you documenting what happens between the different sections in terms of then moving on? So you had mentioned, I have 2 sections of Spanish 1, and when you have this CI focused classroom, the vocabulary is not always going to match up because it depends on what exactly happened that day. So if you have, say, 4 or 5 different sections and they're different languages and they're different levels, how are you keeping track of the vocabulary that happens in each one of those different sections so that when you come back to it, it's picking up where they left off?
The short answer is write and discuss. I do a write and discuss pretty much every day. And then I have a really good smart board. So that's another like blessing that I have, is that I have like one of those smart boards where you can write on the whiteboard and then you can save it. If I have a class and then immediately after I have a prep and I have like some time, I'll actually just like really quickly like plan the do now for the following day while it's like fresh in my mind. But if I don't, I have like the saved write and discuss. But I also do ask the students in class the next day, like if I accidentally said the wrong character name, and like we build community so that they are like, excuse me, that's not what, who is that? Who is Benjamin? But that's like the short answer is I use my tech tools. And if I do have a prep right after a class, I tend to like really quickly just like get some notes down for the next day.
So I think that idea of doing the write and discuss at the end is very brilliant because it has all the purposes of the reason why we would do a write and discuss, but then it's also documenting moving forward. And I always want to make sure that some of our listeners may not be familiar with what we're talking about when we say a write and discuss. So can you tell us in sort of like a minute what that means?
Yeah, so basically if you talked about some topic in your class, maybe you talked about a student, maybe you did a card talk, maybe you did a picture talk or a clip chat, you basically have the students recap with you. So you ask leading questions to get them to remember what had happened in the conversation. And then the teacher normally writes on the board so that the students can connect what they heard during the conversation with how it looks in writing. But then it does act as a kind of a text that you can use for future activities.
There is an episode from, I guess 2 years ago now. I spoke with Ben Fisher-Rodriguez about doing a write and discuss in our classrooms. So I will make sure that that is in the show notes so that people can go back and really get entrenched in what that is, because the fact that you're using it as its intended purpose, as the recap and the vocabulary retrieval, but then also using it as your documentation for the class moving on, is a very effective method. So thank you for bringing that up and bring that into the discussion. Are there some practical steps or strategies that you can offer to teachers? So particularly, I'm thinking if there's a first or second year teacher who's listening right now, and they are being faced with having multiple preps to navigate, based on your own experience and what has been working well for you, what are some of those tips and strategies that you could offer?
Something that really helps me is to have kind of a cycle of activities that I do. So I know that every so often I can go into my grab bag and say, okay, we're going to do taboo, or we're going to do the unfair game, or we're going to do a fast 5 conversation activity. And so students kind of get to know those activities. And you would think, oh, it's not super novel, but they actually, I think, really like the routine of knowing what is coming. And certain activities are really fun. Trash get ball is really fun. So when you pull it out there, they cheer. So just having a kind of like building up your toolbox and then having the same activities that you can do with any type of vocabulary has been really helpful to me. I think it's also just really important to remember that There's a really big mental health aspect to this job in general, and especially if you have so many preps. And like I mentioned before, if you're not feeling well while you're in class, then everything else doesn't really matter.
As I was listening to you talk about everything that you do in your classroom, I've noticed that you have been mentioning a lot of activities that I can see you're very entrenched in the CI world and the comprehensible input world. You're saying things like weekend chat and clip chat and write and discuss and special person interviews and calendar talk and special sevens and the sweet 16 and all of those. And so I think that with a lot of those, even if teachers are not familiar with what all of those are, what I am hearing from you is these activities are not level specific. You only do a write and discuss with a level 1. You actually can do it with all of your levels all the way up. The way you do a calendar talk and a level 1 and a level 4 is going to look very different, but it's still essentially the same activity. And so that's what I was pulling from what you were doing is you're using these activities that can be modified for different levels without having to reinvent the wheel. And so this is a little bit of me putting my teacher coach hat on, and I'm listening to you and I'm repeating back what you said and putting it in a framework. And I'm saying, so this is what I'm hearing. Yeah, but this is what I'm hearing is that you have found these activities that don't require reinventing the wheel and creating something from scratch. You've found the ones that work well and effectively at multiple levels. And that's a way of managing it. And not just that they work well, but they are actually really effective activities.
And they're simple. A lot of these games that you can read about in various blogs. So you don't even have to prepare for some of these.
Are there some other recommendations that you can share with teachers that have been useful for you?
I'm a huge fan of Cécile Lenné. Her website is Toward Proficiency, and she is super generous with resources. And then I have learned a ton from Ben Tinsley. He has some really good resources on his website, so check him out for sure. And then, the Comprehensible Classroom website has like every CI tool in a little blurb about that. So that's super useful as well.
Wonderful. Ben Tinsley is the one person who has been on the podcast 3 times.
Wow.
So he has the record and he is very proud of that. And so if there's ever another third person, he's going to want a 4th. He's going to want a 4th episode. So yes, he's definitely been on because he, as you said, has so much to share. Wonderful.
Yes.
So is there a way that teachers can be reaching out to you, maybe to collaborate or to bounce some ideas off of you? Or if they say, I'm at a loss, any recommendations for me? You've been in the trenches. How can we be connecting with you?
Absolutely. I'm so excited to collaborate with people as well. You can follow me on Instagram. It's at Madame Forker. It's just like MME Forker. You can also email me at my school email address, which is sforker@schools.nyc.gov, if you want to collab in more detail.
Thank you so much. And as we finish the conversation, I always like to leave our listeners with what I call a hearty piece of advice. So is there any advice you can leave us with? It can be about life, teaching, managing preps, anything that's a good nugget for us.
Take care of yourself, whatever that means for you. And remember that teaching is really cool and really important, and also just one part of your identity as a person, which I think you can forget that, especially at the beginning of your career.
Thank you very much for sharing all of your wisdom, your insights, and your experience, which speaks more than anything else and what you've learned along the way, and your willingness to share that with teachers as well. So, Sophie Forker, thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you. Merci beaucoup.
De rien. What are your takeaways from that conversation with Sophie Forker? Are you thinking of some ways of streamlining your planning, or maybe your interest was piqued around some of those CI procedures that Sophie mentioned? Be sure to check out the show notes to connect with Sophie Forker. You'll also see the link to sign up for Talking Points, my weekly email newsletter with tips and resources for language teaching. There are also links to get in touch with me if you would like to work together. We can do that in person in your school or remotely. I will talk to you soon. Bye for now. Thank you for listening to the World Language Classroom podcast. Be sure to follow or subscribe wherever you're listening so that you never miss an episode. Let's keep the conversation going on social media. Connect with me on X, aka Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram at WL Classroom. And for even more valuable resources, visit my website, WLClassroom.com, where you'll find over 300 blog posts about language teaching. So stay inspired, keep growing, and continue making a difference in your language classroom.